Welcome to our final panel of the GM Moving conference. I'm Eve Holt, Strategic Director at GM Moving, and we've got a fantastic lineup for you now. We're starting off with Hayley Lever, Chief Exec at GreaterSport and Executive Lead of GM Moving, with her reflections on the day so far. Hayley starts by talking about the key takeaways from the keynote speaker, Mark Pollock, this morning.
What he said has kind of run through the whole day, which I think has been obviously well designed in, but I've just really enjoyed. And I suppose it's also reflected on how I think the team has come together in organising this conference from, 8 weeks ago, the question of do we go ahead or do we postpone, and a real sense that it was important to go ahead and to kind of invest the time in the people in the system and support people during what was going to be a tricky time for leaders as well. And I think what Mark was saying at the very beginning about that sense of people being colleagues in this work extends not just to our team, but to everybody who's involved in GM Moving throughout Greater Manchester and in our relationships nationally as well. So the question and answers coming through on Twitter have kind of really sort of affirmed all of that too. So he talked about working with complexity, and clearly we're all working with a great deal of complexity at the moment, changes by the minute. So there's an awful lot in what he was saying that we can learn from. He talked about trust, he talked about having empathy and authenticity in our leadership, which is key. He talked about working together towards a just cause, and taking that real kind of long-term view. So he talked about this kind of idea that it's not just about the here and now, it's about the long-term future. And I think in Greater Manchester we take that view. We talk about the health and well-being of future generations, not just about the issues we're coping with today. And his sense of his language around leaders and members, and that we're one of the same thing, we're all in this shared endeavour together, really resonated with me. And then Tim and Katie on the evaluation session at lunchtime picked up on that as well. So we know from our learning that this idea that our strategic leadership, and some of the people we've got in this room now, but right across Greater Manchester, the strategic leadership enables our collective leadership on this journey. And it's really important to GM Moving, it's really important to GM Reform more widely. So having some of our senior leaders in the room this afternoon to talk about that with us is a great opportunity to build on that as well. But what I've loved, I suppose, most of all about today is that we've seen and heard stories from right across the system, from communities, from locality leaders, from Greater Manchester leaders and national leaders, all talking with such a sense of shared purpose and an appetite for learning together and recognising that we haven't got all the answers and that we are finding our way together. So we've heard about the work of people and community groups, local authorities, Transport for Greater Manchester. We've heard about the work of the leisure trusts, housing associations, charities, CCGs, and all of us enabling active lives together. And I think the other thing that's been so key is that more now than ever, the inequalities that are being exposed by the situation we're in has got to sharpen our focus, and we've got to recognise that we don't understand enough yet about what that looks like, but there are people out there in communities who are understanding it, and that we need to engage, and we need to really spend time understanding what's going on. And how, we're really challenged in a session we've just had around the fact that in many communities, staying active is just not even part of the conversation here. These aren't the issues that people are focused on. And so we need to be, we need to acknowledge that, and let's not shy away from it, that our agenda isn't everybody's agenda right now, but we know it does matter. And so we have to find ways to build moving back into life and not rely on people to find the energy and find the capacity to do that for themselves. So the inequalities panel made it really clear just now that it's important that we don't make assumptions in that, and that we need to make sure that there's diversity of perspectives around the table, but right from the earliest opportunity, not further down the line. So we can understand people's lives and co-design things properly together to build that better. So I think it's really important that we keep GM moving during lockdown, as we've been banging the message out constantly over the last 8 weeks. But obviously that's changing all the time. So each phase of emergence from, sorry, I've just spotted we've got somebody popped up on the screen. Just need to, that's it, thank you. So we need to sort of keep agile, I guess. So as things change, and as the new messages come out about what we can and can't do each day, we need to be ready as a system, together and nationally, to kind of unpick that and translate that for people. And I think it's also a really important time to pause and reflect on how we do that, because what we're about is culture change and system change and behaviour change. And there are some massive opportunities right now for culture change in this, sort of COVID response that can actually take us forward to a much better situation for the future. So I think we have got a real sort of constancy of purpose in our shared work. It's taken us to where we've got to, and we absolutely can't lose sight of that goal now. It's really important that we maintain that collective leadership, and I've heard that it's important to connect with leaders across Greater Manchester and keep sort of supporting people, inspiring people as we take things forward together.
Thank you, Hayley. So a great summary there. I think a lot around that sort of designing the diversity and who's in the room, which rooms are we going to as part of that, which was key in our last session on inequalities and what we want to take forward. So you've covered all my questions in one beautiful sweep, one beautiful flow, as you do. So I'm going to move on to Stephen and give him warning so he can unmute himself. I really think that given all of that, all that we're talking around how we're working, so well in lots of ways across the ecosystem with all these different stakeholders, and being really honest about the inequalities that we're facing and the real risks of them growing at the minute. How is GM moving important right now in the context of GM reform and population health and the way that we are working and trying to take on those challenges?
Thanks, Eve. Yes, and I'm going to try and build upon what Hayley's talked about, and hopefully sort of draw back from. I haven't been to the whole of the conference today, but I have picked out some of the sessions, and I'm hoping that some of the things that I want to talk about has got resonance with what's been discussed throughout the day. And it is good to be involved. It's our third. Is it our third conference? This is, isn't it? Our third conference. This is the first one I've worn slippers at, I must say. I'm not sure if it counts as active souls, but there you go. So I wanted to just say a couple of things, really. First of all, what are the critical things I think that we've learned from this journey around GM moving in terms of the evidence and the evaluation and our own experiences, really. And then secondly, I suppose to sort of really get to the nub of what you're saying, Eve. So what is that telling us about the future in terms of where we should be going in terms of just for living and working with COVID, but also that sort of post-pandemic period? And I think actually we've got an opportunity here, not just to sort of set out the blueprint for ourselves, but actually it sort of has enormous resonance with some of the stuff that we're doing in the wider GM context of recovery. And I think there's some very important learning points that sits around that. So just in terms of that first point, in terms of what we know and what we've learned previously, I mean, and I've said these things many times before, actually, but we know that people want to be more active. We know that when we did the survey work around taking charge, that was the thing that people said, that if there was one thing in my life I would change to improve my health, it will be that. We know there's a latent demand around that, and anecdotally we know that actually people have seized some of the opportunity to be more active during this lockdown period. We know that exercise is a magic pill. We know all those things. We also know that inactive living actually contributes to the deaths of about 100,000 people a year. So we know the health benefit that sits around that. But then what we've always said around physical activity is physical activity contributes not just to the health benefit, but actually to the sort of wider prosperity of Greater Manchester. And we know that as well, actually. And it always sticks in my head that there's a two-way relationship between health and wealth. I always used to think the wealthier you are, the healthier you are, but fundamentally as well, the healthier you are, the wealthier you are. And when you see that in terms of some of the systemic statistics that sit around healthy life expectancy, or the levels of people who fall out of the workplace across Greater Manchester, and the sort of long-term conditions that they face up to, all those things tell you how important physical activity is and what this agenda actually means. And I suppose Hayley's point is absolutely right. People aren't talking about physical activity at the moment, but somebody needs to be, and we need to be, because it is a critical part of where we need to get to. And that picture, I suppose, has been made significantly even more stark by COVID. We know COVID hits on the poorest more. and that's primarily because of the higher levels of underlying health conditions. And a colleague of ours, Carolyn Wilkins, keeps saying, COVID hasn't caused inequality. What it's done is merely exposed its extent. And we should be morally outraged about that. And part of the answer really lies, again, in this conversation. There is a lot of learning that's come out of the work that we've done previously around GM moving that needs to sort of, that stands the test of time. I always misquote these figures, but actually, when you look at the impact of GM moving and the associated work that we've done around physical activity, we know that actually physical activity and inactivity is physical activity and inactivity is actually getting better in Greater Manchester than other parts of the country. I know that Tim will say that. In my head, I think it's twice as fast, but Tim probably knows the figures better than I do. And behind that, that didn't happen by chance. There's an enormous body of activity that we've had in place, activity around £500 million of schemes in terms of active travel schemes, the 13,000 social prescriptions, the biggest and most innovative Sport England LDP partnership. You know, all that work sits behind some of those statistics. So for me, then the second question is: so what do we draw out of all of that learning that we need to feed back into our recovery plan? And I just listed a number of points reflecting about this session previously. The first one is we just have some quite amazing and unique assets and synergies that sit across our system. We've got the brilliant political leadership from Andy and others, which sets out that common mission that Mark Pollock was talking about, this morning. We have this amazing partnership with Sport England, and we've got Tim in this session at the moment, and some enormously brilliant collaborative system leadership from GM organisations like GreaterSport, like GM Active, from the voluntary and community sector, from our schools, from our health and care partnership, and sitting all below that actually is that bedrock about trust and relationships, which again has resonance with some of the stuff that we talked about this morning. And then underpinning all of that, and I suppose this is my key takeaway message, is when we started off with GM Moving, we did it in a way that was about adopting a population health model. And it was done in a way that aligned the synergies and the system leadership across GM, and it was done based upon a set of principles about how we wanted public services to be delivered going forward. And I think some of those principles that we talked about and have talked about many times still hold true and still have resonance in terms of the work we're doing going forward. And some of those things, again, you've heard me talk about these things before. They were in Andy's white paper in terms of public service reform, but it is about making sure that we start from a neighbourhood and a place space, and we build from the assets that sit in those communities, and we don't deliver top-down stuff that just sort of bounces off the top of those communities. But we start from a strengths-based model, and we don't concentrate on deficits. And I'm always reminded of the Hillary Cotton quote, but actually we're in the business of not fixing problems but building successful lives. And what could be more resonant in terms of thinking about this in terms of recovery? And then actually looking at some of the stuff that we know is coming at us in terms of exacerbation of long-term conditions, and thinking about the impact of COVID on poverty and mental health and stuff like that. And physical activity has got an enormous role to play in this, but it's the early intervention and prevention model that sits right at the heart of that. And then just final point for me, which absolutely comes back to what Mark was talking about this morning. This is about a collaborative approach. There's no one part of the system that owns this. We're not all soloists, are we? We're all in this together, really. And this is the collective point. And we can't go back to those failed models, which are fragmented, competitive, single system, single sectoral approaches. And I always like using this quote, this is something you have to build, you can't buy. I'll finish there.
Thank you. Good quote to finish on. So that trust and confidence and relationship and ways of working between our public bodies, our institutions and our residents has been really important during obviously our rapid response in COVID. Are there any specific sort of practical learnings or examples from the last few weeks that you want to share, Stephen?
So there's one which is about approach, really, which has been just the agility to get stuff done. over the last few weeks, where we've just cut through things that we thought were insurmountable problems previously, and this way of working where we just all come together and we problem solve, and we don't let things linger in the room, but actually we get on top of them and we resolve them and we deal with the conflict and then we move on. We need to bake some of that ways of working in, I think.
Absolutely, let's bake it in. So Justine, I'm going to come to you. So Justine's the strategic lead of local deliveries for Sport England, who collaborates with us very closely. I'm very grateful for our relationship with GM Moving. So Justine, can you explain what the role of Sport England is in Greater Manchester and how we've been working together?
Yeah, thanks, Eve. Good afternoon. Yeah, I think that the role of Sport England in Greater Manchester is multi-layered and multifaceted. So we have a pilot manager that works on the ground and is very embedded in the work, and works alongside a multitude of organisations now in Greater Manchester, which is fantastic. And we very much wanted, I think, particularly through the local pilot work, to feel that we were in the work alongside you, and not kind of looking in from outside. So I think that probably sums it up in a very practical way. But I think going back to the point that Stephen made, really, and hopefully I'll build on the point you made, Stephen, around in the MOU we set out to help build livable and sustainable communities. And I think, you know, one of the things that takes me back to is that recently, back in November, from a Sport England point of view, we launched new values, and I think that one of my key roles is to live out those values very much in the place. And I think, you know, taking those on board and building on some of what Stephen was saying, one of the real key ones that stands out there is very much around that collaborative approach in the place. And you mentioned that straight away, Eve, which is really good. And I think that is something that is really key to the way that we work with you in the place. I think one of the other roles is very much providing that strategic support by being innovative and creative. So another one of our values is around innovation, and recognising that we can use GM very much as a test bed, and that there is an awful lot in the place that we can build on, learn from, take the learning and share that in many other ways and in other places. It is also about being what I would describe as appropriately ambitious. One of our values is ambition, and I think it's really important that in the right way we utilize that ambition for a shared and common purpose. You know, one of the things that I think we've mentioned earlier this afternoon is about that constancy of purpose, and being really clear about what that is. So I think that is where our ambition comes in. I think a lot of this is around challenging ourselves collectively. I see some of my role is around being able to bring perhaps a different lens sometimes to the work and to what we're trying to achieve, but to always also provide some challenge in the right way around some of that. And you know, to really bring hopefully a different perspective. But I also think that one of the real key things in the way that these behaviours and values are lived out is bringing that with humility. I think, you know, in going back, and I think we've probably touched on it, particularly with the COVID-19 response, you know, is very much around operating with humility, and operating in a way where we know we don't have the answers at the moment, and that, you know, that we are all in this together to learn. And I think that was particularly key to us when we set out with the local pilot manager role, in currently Anna and Kate and so on in the place, is that is the way that they operate. So yeah, I think that probably sums up our role in the place.
So that really, that sense of so the importance of humility there, and the challenge and place, and how we ask good questions and recognise we don't actually have all the answers, but there are other people across the ecosystem within a place, whether that's at a neighbourhood level or a Greater Manchester ecosystem, but also working then with our national partners and sharing that expertise. So in terms of right now, when that humility feels particularly important, and those relationships within a place, is there any specific examples that you'd like to share that you've seen over the last few weeks in the ways that we've been working together?
Yeah, I think there's probably a couple that spring to mind over the last week or so, really. One will be that through our active partnership network, we are wanting to release another sort of tranche of funding out, and we wanted to have an initial conversation with active partnerships about how we would do that, and rather than just drop that money into active partnerships, we wanted to have the conversation early on, and I think what was really key there in working in a collaborative way was how quickly we could set that conversation up, but also the people that we were able to involve on that call. So we had Hayley, and also brought into that conversation Liz Windsor-Welsh from the voluntary sector, and so we were able to have a much more rounded conversation around how best to get that finance to the people that it is most needed by, and to really listen to what would work best in the place, and to be able to collectively reflect on that before making decisions. So that's one. And then another one that springs to mind is just thinking about the network of leisure trusts across Greater Manchester, GM Active, and just in the way again that Hayley and myself and our capital team internally have come together to have a conversation around, again, reflecting on the challenges of where they currently are, and what that means for the sector and how we can best support that. And again, we don't have any hard and fast magic wands in that sense, but just by, I guess, being really open and transparent and entering into a dialogue and into that conversation, I think is in itself a really strong and powerful thing to do collectively. So I think, yeah, those are two examples.
Thank you, Justine. So Tim, I'm going to come to you next. So Tim's the Chief Exec of Sport England. And I guess just to sort of, we've talked a lot about place there and the real importance of recognising within Greater Manchester, diversity within Greater Manchester. But we don't want to just look inwards. It's also really important that we're working with people and partners nationally in sharing that good practice. So in stepping back and thinking about the journey that's taken us here to this far and our relationship. Tim, can you talk a bit about the role of Sport England and how that has changed over recent years, and what you think the future holds?
Thank you, Eve, and I'll certainly do that, although I think it's impossible not to contextualise, obviously, in the current environment. Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, Andy. Nice to see you again, and hello to not only my fellow panellists, but also I'm delighted to say a few names I can recognise amidst those in tuning in. I absolutely wanted to join this afternoon for two reasons. One, this is my second time at your conference, GM Moving Conference. Last year, I remember, was a rainy day at the Etihad. So we're in different circumstances, but very similar in wanting to understand, both from our partnership with GM and the GM Moving MOU that Stephen mentioned, but also broadly how critical it is at the moment for us to understand what's going on locally. And I think when I mean locally, I mean, in areas of the community that generally are not best served by national intervention. I'm going to do something, obviously, I'm going to quote a very wise man here. So I'm going to quote Stephen. because when we were talking a little earlier on this afternoon, he said, you know, that crisis management is a top-down activity, but crisis recovery is a bottom-up activity. And I think in terms of how I would describe where Sport England is at the moment, our response to the current situation is then matches up to that in some ways, because some of our initial purpose, anyway, even before the virus and before this current situation, was changing anyway. I think and Justine has brought to life how in part that's been about how we operate rather than what we do. I think you've asked, you know, where Sport England has changed in the last few years. One of the ambitions I have is that we do recognise that we cannot. God, actually, it's probably worth quoting Stephen again. That's twice in 5 minutes, and I think I'm probably contractually obliged. But Stephen, what you said, something you have to build, you can't buy, at the end of your speech. I think we've increasingly recognised that as a strategic investor, as of public money, that to get meaningful change in activity levels and to transform the health and well-being of the nation, which is after all where we've set our agenda around our strategy and towards an active nation, the document itself, we've realised that we can't transact our way to that. We cannot buy literally the outcomes that are going to change that behaviour. The only way that we can get there is to build it, and to build it in partnership. And so Justine was quite right to focus on how we operate has changed as much as what we're here to do. But I think the acute nature of the current circumstances really does hopefully bring to life where we're at as an organisation anyway. On the one hand, I think we've recognised the power of our resource and our money, and in looking in the very short term to provide what was a very substantial immediate package of support to the sort of wider ecosystem of sport that we knew that we needed now, but will need even more in the future. And whilst we're in no way certain of the impact of that medium or long term, at least in the short term, could we be able to use our resource to offer support to a sector that was suddenly like every other sector of the economy in very, very different circumstances. And part of that is about money, but it's also been about the trust that comes with that. So recognising that we might just need to give organisations some resource because they say they need it, without too much more of the sort of, you know, the historic box ticking and very administrative approach that an organisation like Sport England would take. Or we might just actually talk about our existing resource in a completely different way. And that's been something that we've done, for example, with active partners like GreaterSport and many others, you know, the way in which you can just take what you have and use it differently to manage a short-term challenge. So I think recognising the power of our resource has been really, really important in this time, and that is quite top-down. I mean, inevitably, because you're making choices, you're making decisions, and you're absolutely prioritising where you think there are areas of greatest need. But within that, even, you then have to recognise the trust that's needed in those organisations, not only to deliver, but to be able to deliver with consequence and to deliver with the insight that we don't have. Which is where it's already been mentioned, but the next stage of our investment out, which is a £20 million fund into communities that we think we have not really been able to reach thus far, is really importantly going to be through our partners, not directly ourselves. It won't be an open fund. So in this region, for example, it will be really important, and Hayley's made the point about joining the dots up between the local community groups who understand what the real challenges are on the ground, and the resource that should be directed, in our view, towards helping activity levels both now and in the future. Alongside that, the other sort of top-down intervention in the short term, for want of a better way of putting it, is that we have an obligation, probably more than any other organisation, to worry about activity levels within the nation at this point. And we've tried to do that proactively and positively. We've recognised that even in the previous lockdown situation, where there was very limited opportunity, it was still really beneficial that there was an opportunity to be outside for a short period of time to exercise, whether that's a run, a walk or a cycle. But actually our campaign Stay In, Work Out, which I know was very clearly adopted around Greater Manchester, brilliantly, thank you, was very much geared towards being permissive about being active in the home and recognising there are lots of opportunities for that to happen. And I think we've done, you know, in the short term, we've been able to focus around those two priorities, so supporting the sector and trying to keep the nation active. But what's increasingly come upon us is the realization that we also have a very strong need now to think about the future. And so I'm going to address your question about, the last few years by thinking about what happens next. Because in part that's about the learning that's coming out of, I hate that word, but I've just used it anyway, but the learning that's coming out of and the lessons that are coming out of this situation. And an obvious one would be, for example, a lot of the innovation that's gone on in and around, digital and online communication. But immediately then you hit upon the fact that that doesn't apply to every part of the population. But for those that it has, there's been a significant, quick, short-term, transformation in sport of how people are using online communication and thinking digitally about the future. So there's a good example of a lesson that's come out of the situation. But much more, I think there's some fundamental patterns emerging from the current situation that can really help us define how we should be positioned strategically and how we want to work in partnership. Because we knew already, I think, that the inequalities that have been, I know, discussed at length today are part of the picture in England around who is active and why, and what are the barriers to entry to being active that are sort of systematic and are structural, that are actually going to need some action to overcome. And I think we were gearing up for a fairly strong recognition of that strategically, where we knew that if we were going to genuinely allow the nation as a whole to feel the benefit of activity, to feel the mental and physical well-being that has never been more crucial, and I think to celebrate and recognise the role that sport can play in local communities and the way that clubs are a fabric of many parts of our community, but also how a huge amount of potential social interaction can come through activity. All of that is only potentially currently going to continue to be available to some and not to all. So to try and make it as universal as possible and overcome some of those stubborn structural inequalities, I think we were recognizing that we needed to have quite a disruptive strategic approach and to think very differently about how we worked in place. My sense of the last 6 weeks, which is quite awe-inspiring really, is that disruption is no longer the problem, because we've had the most universal, unprecedented disruption to the system as we see it. Everyone has literally stopped doing it. I mean, so there is no behavior to change anymore, because it's stopped. The challenge, and it's a massive one, is to then start to focus therefore on what do we want the re-emergence to look like. To Stephen's point about, the recovery from a crisis needs to be bottom up. You have to build it in a completely different way. We can't assume that we know how the chips should fall, but they've been thrown in the air. And so that's our job now, is to think about how do we want them to fall, and what can we learn from partnerships like this? What can we learn from place? What can we learn from what's going on the ground? How can we reflect on the fact that, quite rightly, for lots of the people that are in the communities that we all serve and that you serve in Greater Manchester, activity levels are not the priority right now. But to the point that was made earlier by Hayley, somebody needs to be talking about it, and it should be us, because we should be thinking about how those benefits can apply. Alongside that, I know it's a massive thing, and I'm sure Andy will mention it, there is the starting of a conversation, albeit as with everything at the moment, somewhat contradictory conversation, around the benefits of active travel and the possibility here of really introducing meaningful change around open spaces and our travel, with bikes and walking in particular. And I think we have to grasp that opportunity as a result of this crisis. And then I guess lastly, more than anything else, I would say that I reckon from Sport England's point of view is that we have learned the power of our resource, clearly, and where it can be best served. But we have really learned, to Justine's point, that the only way that we will transform behaviour is through trust. And it will be absolutely demonstrably about our ability to set the tone, to set the narrative for why it matters, to recognise that how we operate will actually influence on how successful we can be, but to not determine what that action should be, rather to trust either to regions or to local communities or even down to individuals to make their own decisions about what works best for them. So I do think probably my overriding point, you said where Sport England changed its, we still care about sport in its purest sense. We still care about how organisations and governing bodies run sport. We still care about how important sport is to the nation, and how important it is that anyone who feels that they want to make a life in sport, it can be there for them. But the purpose of that is not to just allow that sport to exist. The purpose of it is that we believe utterly in the power that it can have in improving people's lives and their mental and physical well-being in particular, and on the fabric of the nation and local communities. So our strategy will drive us in that direction, and the absolute priority within that strategy will be the recognition that that is not something that can be universally applied, that it has to belong in place, and that more than anything, inequalities are where our resource and our time and our energy should be greater positioned, that there is a disproportionate feel to the universal application of activity, and we need to make sure that Sport England reflects that. So that's why this partnership is so important. If we think about the local delivery pilot that's going on within the context of the GM Moving partnership, I came into Sport England 18 months ago. I've spent a lot of time around our local delivery pilots. I think they're fundamentally telling us something different. They have turned the telescope around, and we're looking very differently now at problems as a result of the pilots. The Greater Manchester pilot is the sort of pilot of the pilots for us, really. We do things here first, and we do them potentially at greater scale than we're able to do in other areas of the country. So it's a really important partnership, and I'm not just saying that because of all the faces I can see on the screen in front of me and the people that are in the room. It really matters, and I really look forward to our continuing it, both in re-emerging from, coping with and then re-emerging from the current crisis, but also meaningfully putting physical activity at the heart of people's lives.
Thank you, Tim. There's, I don't know the exact quote, I'm sure somebody else here does, but that idea of the pace of change, and that what we can only move as quickly as the speed of trust. I can't remember the exact quote. But that idea that we need to sort of slow down really for the insight and the learning, which is so important, but we need to speed up in the action. And that's certainly what I'm feeling, and it's been great. I've only been at GM Moving for 3 months, but to really have that sense of Sport England definitely being there, building those relationships, building that trust, and wanting to hand that over to communities within a place, and really understanding the importance of place, and us, this people actually in Greater Manchester being able to work with you to say what's needed, but then also be able to provide those spaces where sharing best practice. I was in one of your forums of best practice around place with others working local pilots across the UK just last week, and just rich learnings and patterns. So I'm hugely grateful. Thank you. So on to Andy. Lots there around how we build up as we build back better, which is certainly aligned with your kind of narrative since you were elected a couple of years ago. And I think, as well as what Sport England have done in providing some of that really kind of clear, consistent public narratives around the importance of physical activity and everything around, don't have to, staying in doesn't mean staying still, it means still being active. You've played a certainly really important role over the last few weeks in kind of that public narrative and being clear at a time of uncertainty and lack of clarity. And you've done that in terms of the role of GM Moving and why that's important. So can you share with us some of your thoughts on why GM Moving is important, what progress it's made, and then we can go on and talk about what relevance that has in the current context.
Well, thanks, Steve. It's been great to listen to everybody's contributions. Really positive. Thank you, everybody. It is 3 years since I came into office. This weekend, in a different world, I could have been leaving office today, and a new mayor could have been being sworn in after last week's election, but that didn't happen. I've got another year at least. And actually, I'm just thinking back. It was one of my very first meetings, I think, Tim, with your predecessor, Jenny, to talk about the local delivery pilot. So it kind of was there as part of my kind of term immediately. And I'm thrilled, actually. I'm really pleased to hear you say it, but I'm thrilled to see what it's become, and indeed what GM Moving has become over the last 3 years. To me, it doesn't feel like another piece of the sort of public sector infrastructure. It has the real feeling of vibrancy, of a movement, of a partnership, and that's down to you, Eve, but particularly down to Hayley as well, and everybody who's invested in this over time, the whole team, to be honest. The backing from Sport England is tremendous, Tim. It's important for me to say that, and we're incredibly grateful for it. But it feels as though everything we've learned in the last 3 years is now really going to need to kind of be brought to the fore and put into effect. Because this is probably a unique moment in time now that we've got this particular moment that we're living through. Good and bad, actually, because it could be bad if we're not careful, in that, you know, people might start to return to their cars in greater numbers, with regard to the realities of travelling at this particular moment in time. So we've got to be conscious of that. But actually, I think the positives outweigh the potential negatives, in that, you know, people have been more active in these last 6 weeks. I mean, that's certainly, I don't know whether the figures back that up, but it would appear that is the case. The government original advice to say take one form of exercise, I think in some ways was the most helpful thing that's happened in this whole thing. You know, it was almost like a clear ask of people to go and take their exercise, and people have been referring to their state-sponsored walk or run every day. But I've certainly, as I've been out running, noticed people who clearly have not necessarily been that active before, out and about. And I think we've got to try and capture that change as best as we can. Ironically, I think moving to a new position today or Wednesday that says you can do unlimited exercise might not be as effective, I don't know, as that, you know, do one bit of exercise every day, but we will see. I think we've got to work really hard, though, to keep building on that and remind people of the benefits they felt from being more active physically and mentally, because I think you do see people talking about that at this particular moment. So I think there's positives there, and I think, you know, we talk about building back better. We are going to have to build back different anyway, because of the capacity on public transport. We're not going to be able to come back to how things were anytime soon. So, you know, there's going to have to be change with regard to how people move around. And I was just talking with TFGM before this call. We need to start thinking about how do we facilitate that change. Is this a moment finally to get bikes on trams? I don't know, Stephen. I mean, that's a tablet of stone in GM thinking, but maybe this is with socially distanced trams. Maybe you can start to change that. But yeah, there's one thing. But look at other things. You know, people probably are going to be doing more home working. So how do how can we work with businesses to say, if home working is being offered to some of your employees, maybe not every day, but some people doing it some days, how do we build in the exercise, the single bit of exercise message into that going forward? You know, if you homework, you have to do your one bit of exercise. So you almost get, you know, the private sector to take on the government message coming out of this. If it's more flexible working that people have, you know, flexible start time, end time, you again think of that as a deal with the public. You know, if you're going to take advantage of having more time in the morning, use it to exercise. And I think one of the things that I think we should learn from this is the directness of the messaging. I think has had an impact. So do we need to sort of create a new variation of the messaging? You know, stay active, protect the NHS. You know, just reminding people that, you know, that was what we were encouraging people to do during this time. I think, to pick up what Tim was saying, I do think as we kind of get more distance on this, Eve, I think the statistics will look quite stark as to how the health crisis hit the poorest communities. I think it will be very, very clear that they were, by by far the least able position to face what's happened for a whole complicated set of reasons linked to housing, possibly linked to levels of activity, because I think there is a link already between obesity and people's risks from COVID-19. But also just in terms of people's work, you know, we've all been praising essential workers who've been out there. Well, we've all been having video conferences. The point is, though, that often many of them are in forms of work and employment that don't support physical activity because of the nature of the way in which they're asked to work. So, you know, if we're going to build back better in terms of people's employment, I think you've got to kind of build into that good employment charter notion. How does good employment support people's health? It's not so much linked to physical activity. Here's a vivid example that came from a Unison survey of their Northwest-based care workers. 80% of them said that they feared they wouldn't be paid if they were going to have to self-isolate. So that's a kind of really vivid example of how the nature of people's work doesn't allow them to prioritize their own health. And I think we need to build that argument in around, you know, good employment means looking after your health and building your resilience. So that's, I think, certainly something that we need to take from this. Just thinking aloud, you know, how many of our companies in the city region are part of it? Is it the bike to work scheme where people can get a loan to get to buy a bike? You know, it feels to me that if we are going to have to change the way we commute and the way we move, we would want to see everyone on any income level being able to buy a bike in this particular moment in time. And I think that's something urgently we should look at with TFGM and other partners, because I think a lot of people will want to do that, both from a kind of necessity point of view, because they've no other way of getting around, but also from a sort of more, you know, keeping the benefits that they've been feeling in recent times. I'll just finish on a final point, a broader point really about health evolution, Eve, and the opportunity that may come now with Greater Manchester having a higher degree of devolution around health. I mean, Stephen's actually absolutely right, by the way, about how it's driven change so quickly. Change that kind of wasn't progressing very quickly has kind of happened in a very dramatic way in this period, particularly around digital innovation in health and care and the creation of that single health and care record. And in some ways, what lies behind Build Back Better is a sense of, well, hang on, you can change things very quickly if you put your mind to it. I think that's something we definitely have learned through this whole period, and you know, I think we mustn't lose a sense of that. But I think this argument about health and care reform needs to sort of build through this, and an argument that isn't about a kind of treatment-based health and care system, but if you integrate health and social care, it allows you to create a much more preventative approach to health care than if you leave the NHS as a medical treatment service. And I think we're completely uniquely well placed to lead this argument going forward. We've nibbled at it before, Stephen, haven't we? We've kind of tried a bit before with Care 2020, we called it once, or Living Well at Home. I think we've got to come back with a more compelling proposition now that builds in the social prescribing that Stephen spoke about. But how do we, post-COVID, create an integrated health and care service that does actually empower those people who are potentially at more risk, as we've seen, those communities that have faced the biggest challenge from coronavirus? How do we create a health service that enables them to get physically active as a part of good health, part of building their own personal resilience? And I do think people kind of see that more clearly now in a way maybe they couldn't before this. And so I think, you know, we've got an opportunity to make an argument for a reformed health service that has people's well-being and has their activity level very much at the heart of where we start. And yeah, I'll finish there, Eve, really, because there is so much potential here. I think because of the groundwork you've done in GM Moving running into this, we are in a position where we can capitalise. but I think it's going to be really tough to kind of get quick alternatives for people before they do sort of go to the default easy option, which is to go back to the car or other ways of living. We've got to kind of say to them, we've got to keep reminding them about the kind of feeling they might have had in this era and why it was a kind of it was something that made sense from, that ability to step back, as you said, Eve, and just think about things and reflect about things. People have been reflecting about their own health. I think we've got to kind of find clever messaging that really kind of takes the activity increase in the response phase into a sort of permanent benefit going forward. So those would be a few of my thoughts. Hope they're in tune with the rest of the conference today, and it's great to be able to see everybody and share a few of my own. Okay, I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, Andy. So some key points or suggestions there about kind of the directness of message and how we are quick at grasping this opportunity and before potentially some of the good habits are lost. And then how we absolutely design then moving back into our work as we rethink and reimagine what our workplaces may look like for some of us, into the way we get around, and making sure that is far more integrated and it becomes far more the natural choice. And much easier for more people back into our places and into our health and care system for this to live well approach and live well neighbourhoods. I wanted to pick up on the point around, as you said, about physical activity levels, because I imagine Tim and others are probably busting to answer that question really, just to be clear. So for my understanding that yes, lots of us have seen some people have made it more of a daily habit with that directness of message, and they've enjoyed going out for a local walk, for example, and they've found a new kind of love for being active. But unfortunately, my understanding is that the actual data for that shows that the inequalities that we've seen more broadly are mapped in terms of the levels of physical activity, and actually there has been a growing gap between those that are being active and those that aren't. So I think the latest reporting and data I saw showed that, for example, women, actually there was a growing gap between the number of women that were being active and men, which you could say again is kind of homeschooling and domestic kind of care and all those other things might make it harder. Also in terms of people of colour and our BAME population, there's a great Runnymede report last week, again thinking particularly about place, access, when you're more likely to be in further away from green spaces, less likely to have a garden, may have other concerns around your own safety, which certainly we've had people with Greater Manchester experience, and obviously those that are on low income or living in poverty. Again, we've seen kind of these gaps grow. I don't know if Tim or anybody else wants to add any specific data or anything to add on to what I've just shared as a general picture.
Thanks, Eve, and thanks, Andy. I haven't. I mean, there is specific data, but I mean your point is well made. That and in fact, you were spot on. I think the two lessons we're learning here is that Andy's absolutely right. Creating the environment where the purpose of activity is much more acutely felt, as has happened in this environment, is a really good thing. And I love your idea, and I think so similarly that the real message here should be protect the NHS by when PHE have said that 1 in 6 deaths are caused by inactivity even before the coronavirus. It should have been a message anyway, but it's even more one now. Yeah. I think there's a challenge in there for us and all of us involved in how people are active, that we don't know actually what habits are being built versus those that are being lost, because equally. There might well be people who previously were actively playing sports or in communities or in facilities and gyms where now they've been shut for a period of time, whether that habit will be one. I know certainly the gym sector is very concerned that people might not return even when they're open because they've formed new habits or they've lost that particular habit. But the bigger challenge, and it is being borne out of our recent statistics, is that while overall activity levels are fundamentally maintained, you're right that there is the inequalities which were apparent anyway in the Active Life survey are sustained and indeed in many cases getting worse. And the large driver of that, again, as before, is social economic circumstance. So we have got probably the evidence before us that whilst the benefit of this current environment's allowing exercise and activity has been a positive. What it hasn't done is shift the challenge that we had in the first place. In fact, it's probably exacerbated it.
Thank you for adding that, Tim. So we've got just a couple of minutes left, which isn't time to go through all the questions I've been getting on Twitter and in chat, but maybe in closing remarks, I think we can pick up on a couple of these. So first of all, maybe Hayley has got your closing remarks. There's a question from Kat on Twitter in terms of how we further build the relationships with the community and voluntary sector. And I can imagine that also means extending out in terms of these sort of new mutual aid groups and that great web that has been created in our communities. So maybe you could pick up in your closing comments. And one of the other questions from Graham, who I had the pleasure of speaking to recently, planning in Oldham, really thinking about the importance of the question here of place and planning and policies that really influence the built environment. And as part of the sort of Build Back Better agenda. And there's not going to be a chance to have much of a conversation here, but what Graham doesn't know is we're looking at now in a month, on the 3rd of June, we're hoping to host another conversation, specifically looking at how we create active, healthy places within Greater Manchester as part of the Building Back Better. So I was going to email you, Graham. So let's carry that conversation on. Anybody else who's interested, there'll be an email going out, so please get in touch. So Hayley, do you want to talk about the relationship with the community voluntary sector and any closing remarks?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to finish, actually, because going back to Stephen's point about it being from the bottom up now, it's really important. It's come through all the way through today. There's a challenge that, we've got to be really honest. We're working on a massive geographic footprint here across Greater Manchester. And although we've got our public service reform principles and our GM moving principles and ways of working, it doesn't mean to say that we've got it sorted and that we are genuinely engaging people and communities in everything we do from the beginning and co-designing and co-producing in all the ways we want to. And I think, this now more than ever is critical to our way forward. So, we've got to find new ways, and we are all stretched at capacity, and our voluntary and community sector organisations who we would most want to engage with at this time are more stretched than ever. So we've got great relationships and sense of trust and ways of working, but we need to be agile, we need to be pretty efficient and effective with our time and our ways of working during this time. If we're genuinely going to hear the voices of the people in the community who are telling us, who can tell us, how we can design moving back into life together, when it's not top of a lot of people's priority list at the moment. So our principles are where we start, I think, and a real honesty about where that's working and where it's not, and how we need to do it differently. So I think, the absolutely is the commitment to do that, but it needs an honest conversation and some investment of time, capacity, and working closer together.
Great, thank you. Any burning final reflections from anybody else before I'm going to attempt to play one of the stay in workout videos to help round us off and make sure that you get moving, because you've been sat down for an hour now and that's just not good enough. So,
can I just say, I forgot to mention the work that we've been doing with the districts with Chris Boardman. So, Build Back Better isn't just a sort of a pie in the sky slogan. I mean, I think there is some fantastic work happening. And I was surprised at the appetite from our 10 districts. Tameside and Stephen needed no persuading, but all the others came forward as well. And there was some funding announced at the weekend. So just to reassure people, we are very serious about that, both using the temporary measures, but perhaps bringing forward the B network as well. I think, part of the answer to all of this is that physical change in people's communities as well, isn't it? And if you have that physical infrastructure or the designation of road space for pedestrians, cyclists, runners, etc., I think that would make such a statement in Greater Manchester. And obviously we're looking to everybody on this call today to kind of give courage to our politicians at every level to sort of carry on backing that kind of work, because that's the next stage for us, I think, isn't it? When our communities look different when it comes to encouraging active living, then I think we'll really be then kind of going up a level. And so thank you for all of the support, but yeah, please keep supporting brave politicians who call for roads and pavements to be widened to facilitate active travel. But just thought I'd better mention that, Eve, before we finish.
Couldn't let that go amiss, and I said I had lots of emails and messages over the weekend from people who were wanting to know more and excited about the proposal, so let's keep the movement going. So lots of comments here, some comments about people saying it's really nice to just feel connected and not feel isolated in these conversations. Others saying it's a shame that there isn't more opportunity for interaction on this session, which is not as we'd like, but hopefully we can carry on the interaction outside of this. So I'm going to try and share a video, hopefully, to get us moving, and just say a huge thank you. Please do stay connected with us, keep asking the hard questions, keep working with us, keep growing the movement, keep thinking about who's not in the room, who's not in the conversation, who we're missing, where are the gaps, and what can we do to take that action. And next time somebody says we can't do it, come and talk to somebody here, because we definitely can. So let's keep going, and thank you all. And here we go. Let's, is it going to work? It's gone. Let's leave it. So I think Kaz wanted to share a slide of some of the tweets we've had from today, so I'll let her do that instead. And for anyone who's not yet found our podcast, I've been having brilliant conversations over the last few weeks. Do find our GM Moving podcasts, and you get to hear from people like Sally Carr from the Proud Trust around keeping active during COVID when you're a young person who's LGBT, things around place, around disability. So here's just some of the many tweets we've had over the day with people reflecting on both ways of working, change, activity, and how we get on and work together and continue to build that trust and confidence in our communities. Thank you all.